What if everything you have ever been told about recovering from a life collapse is completely and fundamentally wrong? Today, we are going to challenge one of society's most deeply ingrained pieces of advice. That relentless message telling you to push through the pain, rebuild quickly, stay strong, and get back on your feet as fast as humanly possible. That conventional wisdom, as well-intentioned as it may sound, could actually be preventing you from experiencing the most profound transformation of your entire life. Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant psychological minds of the 20th century, spent decades researching the hidden architecture of the human psyche, and what he discovered about life collapse will genuinely change the way you understand everything you are currently going through. Jung uncovered something extraordinarily paradoxical and deeply liberating. The collapse itself is not your enemy. It never was. That devastating unraveling of your carefully constructed life, your identity, your relationships, your sense of purpose, is not a catastrophic failure demanding immediate repair. It is actually a powerful signal, a profound psychological invitation pointing you directly toward genuine transformation and authentic self-discovery that most people never get the opportunity to experience. What you are about to learn completely contradicts everything mainstream culture has programmed you to believe about resilience and recovery. Society celebrates the person who bounces back fastest, who shows the least visible damage, who reconstructs their old life with impressive speed. But Jung's research reveals that this approach essentially bypasses the very psychological process that makes true healing and meaningful reinvention possible. By the end of this video, you will carry a perspective so liberating and so fundamentally different from conventional recovery advice that starting over will never feel the same way again. The ground beneath you has shifted, and that is precisely where your real journey toward wholeness actually begins. Here is the section. We live inside a culture that is absolutely obsessed with fast recovery. Look around and you will see it everywhere. The promotion goes to the employee who returned to work 3 days after personal tragedy. The social media praise floods toward the person who posts their comeback story within weeks of devastating loss. Grief has been quietly assigned an unofficial expiration date by the society surrounding you. And once that invisible deadline passes, the pressure to rebuild becomes almost unbearable. Carl Jung observed this cultural phenomenon with deep clinical concern, watching as patients arrived in his office completely exhausted, not from their original loss, but from the relentless psychological effort of pretending to recover faster than their inner world was actually capable of processing. What Jung witnessed repeatedly in his clinical work was profoundly troubling. His patients were not fighting their circumstances. They were fighting themselves. They were white-knuckling through grief, suppressing the very emotions and psychological signals that existed specifically to guide them toward genuine healing. And surrounding these struggling individuals were well-meaning friends, family members, and colleagues who, with the best possible intentions, were reinforcing this destructive pattern by celebrating every sign of quick recovery and growing visibly uncomfortable with prolonged pain. Jung used a remarkably clarifying analogy to explain what this cultural pressure was actually creating psychologically. Imagine breaking a bone and immediately forcing yourself to walk on it before proper healing occurs. The bone does not heal correctly. It heals crooked, weakened, fundamentally compromised, and that improperly healed bone will fracture again far more easily under future pressure. This is precisely what happens psychologically when people rebuild their lives too quickly after significant collapse. The healing happens incorrectly, creating unresolved psychological complexes that quietly accumulate beneath the surface, guaranteeing repeated collapses and deeper suffering further down the road. Jung documented a particularly revealing case that illustrates this destructive pattern with remarkable clarity. His patient was a man who had spent nearly 2 decades methodically constructing what appeared to be an enviable life. A stable, loving marriage, a thriving business built entirely through his own determination and sacrifice, a clear, confident identity as provider, leader, and success story. From every external measurement available, this man had achieved exactly what society promised would bring lasting fulfillment and security. Then, within a single devastating year, everything collapsed simultaneously. His marriage dissolved. His business failed. The identity he had spent 20 years carefully constructing simply evaporated. leaving him standing in psychological rubble with absolutely no map forward. What happened next is where Jung's clinical observations become extraordinarily instructive. The man responded by working harder than he had ever worked before. He launched new projects immediately. He filled every available hour with productivity, networking, planning, and forward momentum. His friends admired his resilience. His colleagues praised his strength. By every conventional standard, this man was handling catastrophic loss remarkably well. But Jung saw something entirely different happening beneath this impressive surface activity. The constant busyness was not recovery, it was running. Sophisticated, socially celebrated, completely exhausting psychological running that was preventing any genuine healing from occurring whatsoever. Jung introduced this man to a concept that initially frightened him deeply. The darkness he was desperately fleeing was not actually his enemy. His unconscious mind was not attacking him or punishing him for past failures. It was calling him. That inner darkness accumulating beneath his frantic productivity contained something his carefully constructed old life had never once allowed him to see or access. Hidden aspects of his authentic self, suppressed desires, unacknowledged truths, and genuine purpose had been buried beneath 2 decades of relentless achievement, and collapse had finally created the only opening through which they could possibly emerge. Jung developed one of his most illuminating concepts, specifically to explain why certain life collapses feel so devastatingly total and complete. He called it persona dissolution, and understanding it will fundamentally reframe everything you currently believe about what you have lost. The persona, in Jungian psychology, is not your real self. It is a carefully constructed social mask assembled gradually over years and decades from other people's expectations, childhood rules about who you needed to become to receive love and approval, and versions of success that looked impressive from the outside but felt persistently hollow from the inside. You built this mask with genuine effort and real sacrifice, but it was never authentically yours to begin with. This distinction changes everything about how you interpret your collapse. Jung believed with deep clinical conviction that the collapse is not happening to you. It is happening for you. The old structure that crumbled was built upon foundations borrowed from external sources, parental expectations, cultural definitions of success, relationship roles assigned to you before you were mature enough to consciously choose them. When that structure finally collapses under its own inauthenticity, something profound and necessary is actually occurring beneath the devastation and confusion. Perhaps the most sobering pattern Jung observed throughout his decades of clinical practice involved patients who experienced multiple devastating collapses in relatively quick succession. These were almost never people encountering bad luck repeatedly. They were almost always people who had never genuinely processed their first collapse. Instead of moving through the darkness and extracting its psychological gifts, they had gone around it. They had rebuilt quickly using the same borrowed foundations, reconstructed the same hollow persona with slightly different external details, and guaranteed that the unconscious would eventually force another collapse to deliver the message that was never properly received the first time. Jung identified a pattern so consistent across his clinical work that he elevated it into a foundational psychological principle. Genuine healing and authentic rebuilding require descent before ascent. You must go down before you can genuinely go up. This principle was nowhere more powerfully illustrated than in the case of a woman Jung worked with whose entire identity had been constructed around caretaking. She had devoted herself completely to raising her children and supporting her husband, finding genuine meaning in those roles for many years. Then her children left home, her husband ended their marriage, and she fell into a depression so consuming that she could barely function. Society labeled her broken. Jung saw something entirely different. He recognized her depression not as a dead end, but as a doorway. When the ego structure collapses as completely as it did for this woman, something remarkable happens according to Jung's clinical observations. The unconscious mind steps forward, everything that was suppressed to maintain the caretaker role, her own unexpressed desires, her unacknowledged emotions, her authentic personality buried beneath decades of selfless role-playing, suddenly becomes accessible in ways it never was during the years of careful persona maintenance. The collapse had not destroyed her. It had finally created enough psychological space for her real self to breathe. But here's where most people make the critical mistake that prolongs their suffering indefinitely. The moment genuine unconscious material begins surfacing, it feels terrifying and completely overwhelming. The fear of losing control drives most people scrambling back toward the surface, back toward busyness, back toward premature rebuilding. Jung's patients who found the courage to stop running and remain present within the darkness consistently discovered something that permanently transformed their understanding of collapse. The darkness was never trying to destroy them. It was patiently, persistently trying to complete them, to deliver the authentic wholeness their constructed personas had always prevented. Jung's concept of the shadow stands as perhaps his most practically transformative contribution to human psychological understanding. The shadow is not simply your dark side in the way popular culture casually uses that phrase. It is something far more complex, far more interesting, and ultimately far more valuable than that simplistic description suggests. Your shadow contains everything your conscious mind has refused to acknowledge, integrate, or express throughout your lifetime. It holds your anger that was labeled unacceptable during childhood, your ambition that felt dangerous to display, your grief that overstayed its socially permitted welcome, your wildness, your unconventional desires, your unrealized potential, and perhaps most revealingly, every quality you deeply admire in other people, but have never allowed yourself to consciously claim as your own. The shadow does not disappear simply because you refuse to look at it directly. This is the critical misunderstanding that causes so much unnecessary suffering. When ignored consistently, the shadow grows louder and more disruptive through indirect channels. It manifests as unexplained anxiety that arises without obvious cause, persistent restlessness that no achievement or relationship ever fully quiets, that deeply unsettling nagging sensation that something essential is missing, even when your external life appears genuinely successful and enviable by every conventional measurement available. The shadow is communicating constantly. Most people simply never learn to recognize its language. Here's the mistake that keeps countless people trapped in cycles of collapse and confusion. When the shadow begins rising during periods of life breakdown, most people interpret those emerging feelings as definitive proof that they are broken, damaged, or fundamentally falling apart psychologically. They pathologize the very experience that could liberate them completely. What Jung understood with profound clinical clarity is that the rising shadow is not your most damaged part finally breaking through. It is your most honest part, your most authentic self, finally being heard after years of enforced silence. Jung described the pivotal crossroads that emerges during every genuine life collapse, a moment of profound psychological choice that most people never fully recognize as the turning point it actually represents. One of his most instructive cases involved a lifelong people pleaser, someone who had spent decades burying every difficult feeling beneath layers of agreeableness, accommodation, and relentless self-sacrifice. This person had constructed an identity so thoroughly built around others' comfort that their own authentic emotional life had become completely unrecognizable to them. Then collapse arrived, and with it came something deeply terrifying. Rage surfaced without warning. Dark thoughts emerged that felt completely foreign and frightening. Looking inward, this person could not recognize themselves at all, and became utterly convinced they were broken beyond any possibility of repair. Jung's response to this experience was completely counterintuitive and initially difficult for patients to accept. He explained that the most disciplined suppressors of authentic selfhood always experience the most overwhelming shadow emergence during collapse. The relationship is direct and mathematically precise. The larger and more elaborately constructed the persona mask, the more intense and frightening the shadow material that has accumulated beneath it. This person's terrifying rage was not evidence of brokenness. It was decades of suppressed authentic emotion finally finding the only exit available. What happened next determined everything about these patients' futures. Some found the courage to remain at that crossroads long enough to genuinely hear what their darkness was communicating. They discovered that the rage contained important information about violated boundaries, suppressed needs, and authentic desires that deserved expression and integration. Their rebuilding emerged from genuinely new psychological foundations. Others flinched at the crossroads and retreated, constructing something that looked like recovery from the outside but was internally hollow, smaller than before and quietly suffocating, a diminished life wearing the costume of genuine renewal. Individuation stands as Jung's most profound and ultimately hopeful contribution to understanding what genuine collapse can produce when navigated with courage and psychological honesty. But individuation is frequently misunderstood in ways that completely obscure its revolutionary implications. It is not self-improvement. It is not becoming a better, more optimized version of your previous self. It is not rebuilding your old life with upgraded components and improved strategies. Individuation is something far more radical and far more liberating than any of those conventional self-help frameworks suggest. It is the process of becoming fully yourself for the very first time, not constructing something new, but uncovering what was always genuinely present beneath the accumulated layers of persona, expectation, and borrowed identity. The psychological wholeness that genuine individuation produces has a quality that distinguishes it immediately and unmistakably from conventional recovery. It cannot be shaken by external events in the way your previous identity could be devastated by circumstance. Because it is built entirely on internal truth rather than external roles, achievements, relationships, or circumstances, it carries a stability that no outside force can fundamentally threaten. You are no longer dependent on specific outcomes to feel whole, because your wholeness has finally become genuinely internal. Jung did not develop this framework purely through clinical observation of other people's suffering. He lived it himself with extraordinary intensity. His painful and deeply personal break with mentor Sigmund Freud triggered a profound psychological collapse that pushed Jung toward the edges of his own sanity. Rather than retreating, he descended deliberately into his unconscious, documenting that extraordinary inner journey in what became known as the Red Book. This deeply personal descent through his own darkness, his own shadow material, his own psychological depths, became the lived foundation that validated his entire theoretical framework and transformed his understanding of what collapse genuinely makes possible. Returning to the patients whose journeys we followed earlier reveals something genuinely extraordinary about what becomes possible when the descent is completed with honesty and courage rather than abandoned prematurely out of fear. The caretaker woman, who had lost herself so completely in her roles that depression became her only doorway eventually, stopped fighting her darkness and began listening to it instead. What she discovered beneath years of selfless role-playing astonished her completely. She had desires she had never once permitted herself to acknowledge, creative capacities that had been quietly waiting decades for permission to exist. A voice with genuine things to say that she had systematically silenced. To maintain relational harmony, she began writing. She began saying no to requests that violated her authentic boundaries. She initiated conversations she had spent years carefully avoiding. Her transformation was not a reconstruction of her previous life with minor adjustments. It was a genuine revelation of someone who had always existed but never been allowed to fully inhabit her own life. The businessman's transformation was equally profound and equally surprising. Through his descent, he made a discovery that recontextualized his entire previous life narrative. The relentless ambition that had driven 2 decades of achievement had never actually belonged to him. It had belonged to his father's expectations, internalized so early and so completely that he had never once questioned its authentic ownership. Released from that borrowed drive, he chose differently. Quieter work that genuinely interested him. A simpler life that felt spacious rather than suffocating. Relationships built on honest connection rather than impressive presentation. Jung's deepest conviction, forged through both clinical observation and intensely personal experience, was this: collapse is not a detour from your real life. For many people, it is the actual beginning of it. The authentic self was never something requiring construction. It was always something waiting to be uncovered. An important clarification deserves careful attention here because Jung's framework is sometimes misread in ways that create their own form of psychological harm. Jung was not romanticizing loss. He was not suggesting that devastating collapses are secretly disguised blessings that you should feel grateful for experiencing. He was not encouraging passive surrender to suffering or promoting some spiritually polished narrative. that transforms genuine tragedy into convenient life lessons. What he was doing was something far more practically urgent. He was warning against the desperate, fearful energy of constant motion, that relentless busyness and forced positivity that never allows a single moment of genuine stillness or honest self-examination. The distinction Jung drew between healthy grieving and psychological running is perhaps the most practically useful insight his entire framework offers. Genuine grief moves through you. It has a direction, a momentum, and ultimately a destination. It processes experience rather than storing it indefinitely in psychological compartments where it quietly accumulates pressure. Psychological running, disguised convincingly as productivity, optimism, and admirable resilience, moves around the wound rather than through it, and whatever you consistently move around rather than through does not diminish with time. It grows larger, more influential, and more capable of eventually forcing the confrontation you have been successfully postponing. Jung also observed something that carries profound implications for how we understand collapse itself. These devastating life breakdowns rarely arrive from nowhere without warning. They are almost never random, catastrophic events that strike without precedent. They are almost always the loudest, most impossible to ignore version of a message that had been whispering persistently for years, sometimes decades, through relationships that never felt genuinely right, careers that looked impressive but felt hollow, and identities assembled from expectations that never authentically fit the person wearing them. The collapse is not the beginning of the problem. It is the problem finally demanding to be genuinely heard. Jung's therapeutic guidance for navigating genuine collapse was refreshingly concrete and immediately applicable, beginning with a single foundational practice that most people find simultaneously simple and profoundly uncomfortable. Stop. Create deliberate stillness in the spaces previously filled with noise, distraction, productivity, and motion. And in that stillness, practice something Jung considered absolutely essential to any genuine transformation. Radical private honesty, not the performed honesty of social media vulnerability, not the carefully edited self-reflection shared with others for validation, but the uncomfortable, unwitnessed, completely private honesty that emerges only when you stop managing how your inner life appears to the outside world. Jung instructed his patients to examine their collapsed lives with unflinching clarity, asking questions that conventional recovery culture actively discourages. What had actually been wrong in the old life long before the collapse arrived? Not what went wrong suddenly, but what had been quietly, persistently wrong for years, that you had been successfully pretending not to notice. What had you been suppressing so consistently that suppression itself had become invisible and automatic? What had the collapse been signaling through whispers, through restlessness, through that hollow feeling, through the relationships and roles that looked right but never genuinely felt right from the inside? These questions are not exercises in self-blame or retrospective criticism of past choices. They are acts of profound psychological respect toward yourself. They are the process of finally listening to the part of you that has been attempting communication for years, through every available channel. When you sit still long enough to genuinely hear what your shadow has been trying to communicate, something transformative occurs. The darkness stops functioning as your enemy and begins functioning as information. Extraordinarily valuable, deeply personal, completely honest information about who you actually are beneath the accumulated roles. And that information, Jung discovered consistently, becomes the only genuine raw material from which an authentically new life can actually be constructed. Everything Jung discovered across decades of profound clinical work and intensely personal psychological exploration points toward a single liberating truth that contradicts almost everything. Contemporary culture teaches about collapse and recovery. The people who genuinely transform through devastating life breakdown are not more resilient than those who struggle. They are not stronger, more gifted, or more psychologically fortunate. They are simply more willing to go through rather than around, more willing to descend before ascending, more willing to sit in genuine darkness long enough to hear what it has been trying to communicate. The framework Jung developed moves through a clear and coherent progression. Persona dissolution reveals that what collapsed was never authentically yours to begin with. Shadow confrontation transforms your most frightening inner material from enemy into honest information. The descent into the unconscious creates the psychological space where suppressed authentic selfhood finally becomes accessible. And individuation, the ultimate destination of this courageous journey, produces a wholeness so genuinely internal that external circumstances lose their previous power to define or destroy you. Jung's most powerful reframe deserves to be carried with you beyond this video. Your collapse is not a grade on your performance. It is not evidence of fundamental inadequacy or irreparable failure. It is an invitation, perhaps the most important invitation your life has ever extended, to stop performing altogether, to stop maintaining the mask, to finally meet the person who was always present beneath the accumulated roles, expectations, and borrowed definitions of success. The person waiting on the other side of genuine descent is more solid, more real, and more authentically capable than the persona that collapsed could ever have been. If this framework has genuinely resonated with you, please subscribe for more psychology-based insights. Like and share this video with anyone navigating their own collapse, and explore the Alchemist's Path ebook at thesurrealmind.com for deeper guidance on this transformative journey.